The servants of Whitehall Palace spent the last 3 days of January 1547 carrying hot dinners to a dead man. Trumpets sounded in the gallery the way they always did when the king's food went by. Ushers bowed at the chamber door. Dishes went in under silver covers, sat there for a while, and came back out. On the other side of that door, Henry VIII was lying in the great bed where he had died at around 2 o'clock in the morning on January the 28th, 55 years old, so heavy that it would soon take 16 of the strongest men in his guard to lower his coffin into the floor. The men running the country knew he was dead. Almost nobody else did. The ports were shut. The roads were watched, and the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, a man whose entire job was knowing things, spent those 3 days writing home that something felt wrong at court, while the trumpets kept announcing meals for a corpse. That image is where this whole story eventually lands. A palace performing a heartbeat that had stopped. Because the man behind that door had once been, by the honest testimony of people who had no reason to flatter him in private letters, the most physically impressive king in Europe, 6'2" when most men stopped well short of that. An athlete, a jouster who frightened his own council with the risks he took. And over about 40 years, that body rotted while he was still living inside it. His legs opened up and never healed. His court learned to smell him coming before they saw him. The mind curdled along with the flesh, and by the end, telling him the truth about his own health was legally treason, so he lay dying, surrounded by people who were forbidden to say the word. Before we go back to where all of that started, a quick minute for the channel. Welcome in, whether this is your first video here or your 50th. While you're getting settled, do something for me down in the comments. Tell me where you're watching or listening from and what time it is there. City, country, 3 in the morning on a night shift, whatever it is, I see every one of them. A massive thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them, everything you need is down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the beginning, when nobody could have predicted any of this. April 1509. Henry Tudor becomes King of England at 17, a couple of months short of his 18th birthday. And the reaction across Europe is close to disbelief. His father, Henry VII, had been a thin, careful, suspicious man who spent his reign counting money and worrying about plots. The son looked like he had walked out of a different bloodline entirely, and in a way he had. Contemporaries said he took after his grandfather Edward IV, the tall Yorkist king famous for his looks. The new Henry stood around 6'2" with red gold hair, fair skin, and a build that ambassadors kept describing in their dispatches with a tone that borders on embarrassing. The Venetian envoy Sebastian Justinian called him the handsomest potentate he had ever set eyes on, and went on about his round face, his throat, his calf. Ambassadors talked about his calves a lot, actually, and so did Henry. A good calf was a serious matter in an age of tight hose, and Henry knew his were excellent. When another Venetian was asked to compare him with the King of France, Henry pressed him on it directly. Was Francis's leg as good as his? The ambassador tactfully said the French king's legs were spare. Henry opened his doublet, put his hand on his thigh, and said, "Look here, and I have also a good calf to my leg." He was showing off his body to a foreign diplomat, and by every sign enjoying it enormously. The legs are where this story turns. The physical record from those early years is unusually solid. Kings had armor made for them. Armor has to fit almost like tailoring, and several of Henry's suits survive. A field armor built for him in his early 20s, now in the Tower of London, was made around a waist of just under 35 inches and a chest of about 42 on that 6'2" frame. Lean, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the middle. One of his foot combat suits from the same period weighed about 94 pounds, and he fought in it on foot, swinging weapons in front of crowds. Portraits lie for a living, but steel does not. You can stand in front of that early armor today and see the very man Justinian was gushing about, and then you can walk a few feet along the same gallery and see what he became, measured in the same honest metal. We'll get there. The young king's appetite for exercise was close to compulsive. He rode, by some accounts, up to 20 miles in a day just hunting, wearing out 8 or 10 horses while the men around him begged off. He played tennis so well that watching him was described as the prettiest thing in the world, his fair skin glowing through a fine shirt. He wrestled, threw the 12-foot bar, drew a longbow with the best archers in his guard, danced until the older courtiers gave up. His father had kept him off the tilt-yard as a boy for the simple reason that after Prince Arthur died, this second son was the only male heir left, and jousting killed people. The moment the old king was in the ground, Henry ignored all of it. He wanted the tilt more than almost anything else his crown could give him, and for the next quarter century the tilt-yard was where he felt most like himself. One more scene from the golden years, the saddest one. For about 7 weeks in 1511, Henry had everything. On New Year's Day, Catherine of Aragon gave him a living son, named Henry after his father, immediately Duke of Cornwall, heir to everything. The king was 20. His response was one of the most extravagant celebrations of the whole century. Days of pageantry at Westminster culminating in a grand tournament where Henry jousted before his queen under the name Sir Loyal Heart, that was actually embroidered on his costume, and afterward let the crowd surge in and strip the gold ornaments off his own clothes as souvenirs, laughing while they did it. On February the 22nd, the baby died. 52 days old, no cause was ever recorded. The court went from pageant to funeral inside 2 months, and the little duke was buried in Westminster Abbey, while his parents grieved in ways the record only glimpses. Catherine devastated, Henry reportedly composing himself to comfort her. The pattern that baby began, sons who came and then went, would eat this man's life from the inside and drag a whole country's religion down with it. In 1511, though, it looked like a single unbearable tragedy, and everyone assured the young couple that more children would come. The sport itself, plainly, 2 riders, each on a horse weighing somewhere north of half a ton, closing on each other at a combined speed that could pass 40 miles an hour, each holding a wooden lance aimed at the other man's head and chest. The lances were designed to shatter, and when they shattered they threw splinters, and the splinters went wherever physics sent them. At the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, that famous glittering summit between Henry and Francis of France, a French jouster was killed during the festivities, and the party carried on around his body. In 1526, Henry's close friend Sir Francis Bryan lost an eye in a Shrovetide joust and wore a patch for the rest of his life, and the court treated it as roughly the cost of doing business. And in 1559, a few years after Henry's death, King Henry II of France took a splinter through the eye and into the brain during a celebratory tilt, and died over 10 days in agony, while the best surgeons in Europe practiced on the severed heads of executed criminals, trying to figure out how to save him. That was the sport. That was the hobby the King of England refused to give up. He designed armor for it and rode in it with a recklessness that terrified the people whose lives depended on his heartbeat. On March the 10th, 1524, that recklessness nearly ended the reign 15 years into it. Henry had a new suit of armor, partly of his own devising, and he wanted to test it in the tilt yard against his brother-in-law and closest friend, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Brandon was one of the few men in England big enough and good enough to give the king a real run. The two of them took their positions, the crowd settled, and then people near the king started shouting. Henry had ridden to the tilt with his visor up. Whether he forgot to lower it or the new headpiece failed to fasten is genuinely unclear, but his face was bare and Brandon could not see it. Brandon's own helmet, by his account afterward, gave him so little vision that he could barely make out the other end of the barrier, and he could not hear the crowd screaming at him to hold. He spurred forward. The chronicler Edward Hall, who wrote the fullest account, says the Duke's lance struck the king on the brow, right beneath the guard of the headpiece, on the very skull cap, and shattered, filling the king's helmet with splinters. A hand's width lower, and it takes him through the face. The whole yard understood in one breath that they had just watched the King of England almost die, just as the King of France would die 35 years later. What Henry did next tells you everything about the man at 32. He got up, declared loudly that nobody was at fault but himself, comforted Brandon, who was in pieces and swearing he would never run against the king another time, and then, to prove to the crowd that he was fine, called for his horse and ran 6 more courses. 6. With a head that had just taken a lance strike hard enough to pack his helmet with wood. The crowd loved it. His counsel presumably aged a decade on the spot. Some historians looking back at his later headaches, the migraines that started troubling him in the years afterward, wonder quietly if this was the first installment of a debt his brain would keep paying. Nobody in 1524 had a word for concussion. The treatment was 6 more courses and a feast. The following year gave the court another preview, one that started as farce and nearly finished as a drowning. Out hawking near a stream, Henry came to a ditch and did what athletic young men do. He planted a pole and vaulted it. The pole snapped. The king went in head first, into mud thick enough to hold him, and stuck there upside down, drowning in a foot of dirty water in the middle of the English countryside. A footman named Edmund Moody leapt in, hauled him out by main strength, and thereby quietly earned a place in history as the man who saved the entire Tudor century from ending in a ditch. Henry rewarded him. The story got told with laughter, but shift that afternoon a minute in the wrong direction and Anne Boleyn dies an obscure gentlewoman. The monasteries stand, and everything you know about this period never happens. Around this same stretch of the 1520s, almost unnoticed, the first quiet problem with the legs appears in the record. In 1527, the surgeon Thomas Vicary was called in to treat what the documents call a sore leg, most likely a varicose ulcer, a burst or weakened vein near the surface. Vicary managed it well enough that the king made him sergeant surgeon, and the thing seemed to heal, and everyone moved on. A sore leg on a hard-riding athlete in his mid-30s. Nothing, except that veins damaged that way do not really repair themselves. They wait. Henry also began suffering from headaches severe enough to be mentioned in his letters, and by the 1530s he was writing to Anne Boleyn, apologizing for a short note because his head ached. A slow tide was already moving under the surface of that magnificent body, and the man himself, still hunting, still showing his calf to ambassadors, had no way of knowing it. Greenwich then, January the 24th, 1536, and the 2 hours that a lot of historians now treat as the hinge of the entire reign. Henry was 44, still tilting, though a 44-year-old body in 90 pounds of steel is a different proposition from a 25-year-old one, and everyone at court could see it except possibly him. That day, in the tilt yard at Greenwich Palace, he ran a course, and something went wrong. He came off. His horse, itself wearing armor, came down on top of him. Add up the total mass involved. A big man, his plate, a warhorse, the horse's plate, all of it landing on the man at the bottom of the pile, and you have some sense of why the yard went quiet. 3 contemporary accounts of that afternoon survive, and they do not quite agree. So I'll give you all 3, and you can weigh them yourself. Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador and one of the most reliable gossips in England, reported that the king fell heavily but escaped without serious injury. Charles Wriothesley, a herald with good access, said much the same, a marvel that he was not hurt. But Dr. Pedro Ortiz, writing from Rome on information relayed through diplomatic channels, recorded something the other 2 either did not know or chose not to send, that the king had lain for 2 hours without speech. 2 hours. If that detail is accurate, and it comes third hand, then by any modern standard Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury that day. A team of neurologists writing in the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience in 2016 went through the whole medical record and argued exactly that. A brain injury at Greenwich sitting underneath everything that followed, the rages and the memory failures everyone around him noticed. One of the authors put it memorably that European history may have changed forever because of a blow to the head. The historian Lucy Worsley has made the same case in plainer language, that the accident of 1536 explains the transformation from a sporty, generous, promising prince into a cruel, paranoid tyrant. Other historians push back and point to the ambassadors on the ground who said he was fine. The sources sit there side by side, saying different things, and the truth is somewhere in that gap. What is beyond argument is the wreckage that spread out from that tilt yard within days. News of the fall raced through the palace, and someone, probably the Duke of Norfolk, carried it to the Queen. Anne Boleyn was pregnant, somewhere around 3 or 4 months along, with what everyone believed and desperately hoped was the son the whole break with Rome had been staged to produce. On January the 29th, 5 days after the accident, and on the very day her predecessor Catherine of Aragon was lowered into her grave at Peterborough, Anne miscarried. The fetus, the reports said, had the appearance of a male child of about 15 weeks. She blamed the shock of hearing the king was down and might be dead. Whether the fright caused it or the timing is coincidence is another one of those gaps, but Henry's reaction is on record, and it is cold enough to sting across 5 centuries. He said, more or less, that he saw God would give him no male children, and he left her weeping. Within 4 months, Anne Boleyn had been arrested, tried on charges her own judges struggled to keep straight, and beheaded on Tower Green by a swordsman brought over from Calais. The queen he had turned Christendom upside down to marry went from carrying his heir to a headless body in an arrow chest in the space of a spring. Susanna Lipscomb wrote a whole book arguing that 1536 was the year that made him what he became, and it is hard to look at those months and disagree that something in the man snapped. He never jousted after that day. For a man whose identity had been built on that yard since he was 17, the loss cut somewhere deeper than sport. The tilting, the 20-mile hunts, the tennis, the dancing, all of it either stopped outright or dwindled towards ceremony over the next few years. The colossal appetite of a man burning 6,000 or 7,000 calories a day in exercise did not stop with it. And beneath everything, the fall at Greenwich had done something specific and permanent to his legs. Old damage tore open. Some historians think the varicose trouble Vickery had patched a decade earlier burst under the impact. Others suspect fragments of bone in one or both crushed legs went on to seed a chronic infection deep in the bone itself, a condition called osteomyelitis that no medicine on earth could touch until antibiotics arrived 4 centuries too late for him. Either way, by 1537 he was writing to Norfolk in his own words that a humour had fallen into his legs, and the wounds that opened that year would still be open, still draining on the morning they soldered him into his coffin. Polite history has spent 500 years hurrying past those wounds, and Henry's last decade makes no sense without them, so here is the reality. From roughly 1536 onward, the king had open ulcers on one and eventually both legs, deep suppurating sores that wept pus more or less continuously, that would sometimes scab over and seem to close, and then swell, go hot, and burst open worse than before. Chapwys, who saw a great deal of the king in these years, described them simply as the worst legs in the world. The pain came in 2 registers, the constant grinding ache of inflamed and possibly infected bone, and then the episodes, the fevers and blockages when a wound sealed itself and the whole leg backed up like a blocked drain. On his good days, he limped and concealed it. On his bad days, he could not walk at all, could barely speak, and the entire government of England slowed to the rhythm of his dressings being changed. Now the treatments, and fair warning, this is where the story starts earning the title of this video. Tudor medicine ran on a theory inherited from the ancient world. The 4 humours, the idea that health was a balance of fluids and that illness was corruption or excess that needed to be drained out of the body. Under that logic, a suppurating ulcer was a vent. The evil humours of the king's body were escaping through his legs, and if the vent closed, the corruption would back up into the body and kill him. So the goal of his physicians, and this is the part that takes a second to absorb, was frequently the opposite of healing. When the ulcers tried to close, his surgeons opened them. They cut away new flesh as it formed. They inserted foreign objects into the wounds, little balls and threads, to hold the channels open and keep them draining, a technique the textbooks of the day fully endorsed. They burned the raw tissue with heated irons to cause fresh, controlled suppuration, cautery that was called, and the smell of it, hot metal on infected flesh, would have carried through the privy chamber and into the rooms beyond. All of it, every cut, every iron, every probe pushed into an open ulcer, was done on a conscious man, because effective anesthesia was 300 years away. The King of England, the most powerful human being in the country, gripped whatever was in reach and endured it, and then got up and held audiences. Between the surgical sessions came the daily regimen, poultices of violet leaves and mallow, linseed pounded with fresh eggs, plasters laid over the sores and peeled off with everything they had absorbed, bleeding from the arm to rebalance the humours of a man already losing fluid through his legs day and night, purges and clysters to drain him from the other end. Henry, being Henry, refused to be a passive patient. He fancied himself something of a physician, and a manuscript survives in the British Library, a book of over 180 medical recipes compiled for him in the 1540s, with several remedies devised by the king himself, including a plaster of his own invention that he formulated at Hampton Court, made with pearl and other costly ingredients. The most powerful man in England, in constant pain, sitting up at night designing his own wound dressings. Nothing in that book could touch what was actually wrong with him, but he kept at it. His doctors, William Butts and John Chambray, and the surgeons under them, were among the best in the kingdom, and everything they knew was wrong, and everything they did with genuine diligence and care made him worse. That might be the quietest tragedy in this whole story. He had constant, expert attention by the standards of the day, and the standards of the day amounted to a slow-motion torture program. Then the smell. Everyone at that court lived inside it for years, and skipping past it would flatter the room. A chronic suppurating ulcer, particularly one with infected bone underneath it, produces an odor that modern nurses who work with such wounds will tell you is among the worst things a human body can generate. A medical paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, going back through the sources, put it in one flat sentence: that the stench from his infected ulcers could be identified 3 rooms away, often heralding the monarch's arrival. Heralding the monarch's arrival, as if the smell had joined the procession. Courtiers knew the king was coming before they heard him, before any trumpet, because the air changed. And nobody, not one person in that palace, could ever show it. You stood in the presence of a rotting man who could have you killed. You breathed through your mouth. You kept your face perfectly arranged, and you told him he was looking well. Every day, for years. His fool, Will Somers, was one of the very few people allowed to say anything true to him at all, and even Somers knew where the edges were. The wives had it worst. His last queen, Catherine Parr, is recorded spending evenings with his leg resting in her lap, the dressings right there under her hands, talking theology with him to keep his mind somewhere else. Whatever else you conclude about the woman, that was a form of courage. Twice in those years, the legs came within a breath of killing him outright. And the first of those episodes produced one of the most disturbing eyewitness lines in the entire Tudor archive. May 1538. One of the fistulas, The drainage channels in the king's leg closed up. For 10 or 12 days, the fluids that normally poured out of him had nowhere to go, and his body began to poison itself from the inside. The French ambassador, the Sieur de Castillon, sent home a dispatch that survives, and I'll give it to you close to his own words. The king had one of the fistulas of his legs stopped, and for 10 or 12 days the humours which had no outlet were like to have stifled him, so that he was sometime without speaking, black in the face and in great danger. Black in the face. The King of England lay in his bed at 46, mute, his face darkening, while the greatest physicians in the realm hovered around him with their plasters and their irons and no earthly idea what was happening inside him. The modern medical guess, and it can only be a guess, is a clot, a thrombosis in the damaged veins that may have broken loose and travelled to a lung, a pulmonary embolism, an event that kills healthy people today with hospitals 10 minutes away. Somehow his body rode it out. He surfaced after those 12 days, weakened, and the court exhaled, but during that stretch of silence something notable had happened in the corridors. Men had started, very quietly, discussing what came next. The heir was a baby, the daughters were bastardized by their father's own statutes, and a few councillors had begun weighing Mary against Elizabeth in whispers, in a country where speculating about the succession could cost you your intestines. That is how close it was. They had started planning for the world after him while he lay there turning black. Word of the king's leg travelled further than the court too, and people were listening for it. That same year, under interrogation in the Tower, a gentleman named Geoffrey Pole let slip what a lot of England was privately thinking. The king, he said, had a sore leg that no poor man would be glad of, and he should not live long. A prisoner in the Tower, facing the destruction of his whole family, and the thing he reached for was the leg. Everyone knew. The magnificent king of the coronation pageants had become, in the mouths of his own subjects, a sick man with a leg no beggar would trade for, and a countdown had started in people's heads that nobody was allowed to say out loud. What Henry did to the rest of that family over these exact years shows the temperature of the man as his body failed, and it ends in a scene we will need strong stomachs for. Geoffrey's brother, Cardinal Reginald Pole, had written against the king from the safety of the continent, and Henry, unable to reach the cardinal, reached for everyone the cardinal loved. Brothers, cousins, and eventually the mother. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was a woman in her mid-60s, one of the last Plantagenets alive, a former governess to the king's own daughter Mary, and by every account a pious old noblewoman who had committed nothing a court could dress up as treason, so Parliament simply condemned her by attainder without a trial. She sat in the Tower for 2.5 years, poorly clothed against the cold, until the morning of May the 27th, 1541, when she was told, with almost no warning, that she would die within the hour. She was 67. Chapuys reported what happened on the scaffold, and there is no gentle way through it. The regular executioner was away in the north, and the job fell to a young man Chapuys called a wretched and blundering youth. The first stroke of the axe missed her neck and bit into her shoulder. She was an old woman, alive and conscious, and the boy kept swinging. Accounts speak of the blows falling on her head, her neck, her shoulders, hacking rather than severing, and one later tradition, unverifiable but persistent, has her rising from the block. However many strokes it truly took, what died on Tower Green that morning was a grandmother butchered in installments on the orders of a king she had once served at his own christening. Henry was not present. He rarely was. He signed, and other men did the wet work, and this, in the 1540s, was the version of him that his own body's decay was helping to sharpen. The year of Margaret Pole's butchery had opened fittingly, with the butcher himself flat on his back. In February and March of 1541, the leg closed up once more. The fever came roaring in, and for a stretch of days, Marillac was reporting home that the king's life had been in genuine danger. He pulled through, as he kept somehow pulling through, but this time the recovery brought something new, and courtiers whispered about it, a black depression settling over Whitehall. The king, who had once kept the greatest musical establishment in Europe, let Shrovetide pass almost without festivity. He shut himself away, refused his ministers, and was heard complaining that he had an unhappy people to govern, and that most of his privy council, under pretence of serving him, were only working for their own profit. He was probably right about that last part, and it cannot have improved his mood. Chronic infection does this to a body. Each episode of sepsis takes a toll the recovery never fully repays, and it does something to a mind too, and the sources let you watch both processes running in parallel through the 1540s, the leg flaring, the mood blackening, the executions clustering, then a lull, then the next flare. While the legs rotted from below, the rest of him expanded, and the scale of it is hard to overstate. Go back to that armor gallery in the Tower. The suit from his early 20s, waist just under 35 inches. A suit from 1540, made for the May Day tournament he could only preside over rather than ride in, measures 51 inches at the waist and 54.5 at the chest. 16 inches of waistline gained, most of it in under a decade, and the armourers of Greenwich just kept letting out the steel because the king kept ordering suits for a body that would never fight in them again. By the end of his life, the estimates put him around 28 stone, roughly 390 pounds on that same 6'2" frame. When the Royal Armouries exhibited the suits side by side a few years ago, their academic director made the point that armour has to fit closely, so you get an impression of the man in the flesh that no painting can give you. Food was the engine of it, though the story is a little more human than the glutton of popular legend. The Tudor court ate on a scale that belongs in the supply ledgers of a small war. The household ordinances set out the daily tables, and the historians at Hampton Court have done the sums. Courtiers at the top of the hierarchy were served spreads running to about 5,000 calories a day, dish after dish of roasted meats, game, pies, sweet wine. In a single year, the court could get through over 1,200 oxen, more than 8,000 sheep, a couple of thousand deer and pigs and calves, and around 600,000 gallons of ale, with tens of thousands of gallons of wine on top. Henry dined at the centre of that machine, often alone at a raised table under a canopy, his food announced with trumpets, dishes of swan and venison, and conger eel, and even porpoise carried past bowing servants to one seated man. The legend leaves one thing out, though. Search the more than 20 printed volumes of his reign's letters and papers, and you find essentially one direct contemporary complaint about his eating from the French ambassador Marillac in 1540, who wrote that the king was very stout and marvelously excessive in eating and drinking, so much so that people of credit said he was often of a different opinion in the morning than after dinner. One line from one Frenchman being catty. The deeper truth is probably simpler and sadder. A man who had spent 30 years burning an athlete's furnace of calories lost in a single January afternoon every way he had of burning them, and the meals kept arriving with trumpets, and the pain kept needing to be dulled with something, and wine and food were what he had. Modern people who have watched an injury end someone's active life will recognize the shape of it. His just happened at the scale of a king, with an entire kitchen complex feeding the fire. By the 1540s, the machinery of the court had to be quietly rebuilt around a man who was ceasing to move. His household inventory, drawn up after his death, lists 2 chairs called trams, upholstered in tawny velvet, quilted, fitted so that servants could carry or wheel the King of England through his own galleries, because his legs would no longer do it. At Whitehall, historians have found record of a device on the great staircase, a chair that goeth up and down, rigged with rope and pulley, a block and tackle system by which teams of men hauled their sovereign up a 20-foot flight because he could not climb it. When he insisted on riding, and he did insist, he had to be lifted into the saddle with mechanical help, hoisted like cargo, and his horses were chosen for what they could bear. He took to spectacles for his failing eyes. Dozens of pairs of them appear in the inventories. And attending all of this, at the most intimate range imaginable, stood the groom of the stool and the gentlemen of the privy chamber, the men whose actual sworn duties now included managing the body of Henry Tudor at its most helpless, the dressings, the close stool, the lifting, the turning, the cleaning. The last man to hold that office, Sir Anthony Denny, will matter enormously at the end of this story. Nobody in England stood closer. Denny knew the truth of the king's body better than any bishop knew his soul. Even hunting, the last great passion left to him, had to be re-engineered around the wreckage. The man who had once run down deer over 20 miles of country, now killed from a standing, a fixed platform, while servants and hounds drove the game past him in a manufactured stream so that the King of England could still be described in official language as taking his sport. Parks were managed so the animals came to him. He sat, braced with a crossbow or a gun, and the deer were herded into range, and everyone maintained the pleasant fiction that this was the same activity he had loved at 20. Toward the end, even that was beyond him on bad days, and the sport shrank to watching. A detail like that does more than any physician's report to show what daily life had become. A court dedicating enormous labor, whole staffs of men, entire redesigned landscapes to preserving the appearance of capacities the king no longer had, because the appearance was itself a matter of state. A visibly dying monarch invites plots. So the deer were driven, the chair was hauled up its staircase out of public sight, and the fiction was maintained at every level from the parkland to the privy chamber. Even so, the will inside the ruin stayed frightening. In 1544, aged 53, ulcerated, enormous, barely able to walk, Henry took himself to war in France one last time. He crossed the Channel and besieged Boulogne in person, carried to the siege lines in a litter, hoisted onto a great horse for the moments that required a king to be seen mounted, wearing armour built around that 51-inch waist. His counsellors had begged him to stay home. The town fell to him in September, and he rode through it in what everyone understood was a farewell performance. The body was finished as an instrument of war. The ego, and honestly you can call it courage too, both things were true of him at once, had one more campaign in it, and he spent the last of his physical credit on that Boulogne mud. He came home to England and never really recovered his strength afterward. From 1545 onward, the record is a slow drumbeat of fevers, confinements, closed doors. July of 1545 handed him one more horror, and this one he had to watch with his own eyes. The French, in reply to Boulogne, sent an invasion fleet into the Solent, and Henry travelled down to Portsmouth to oversee the defence, dining aboard his flagships, playing the war king a final time. On the 19th, standing with the shore party at Southsea, he watched his beloved warship, the Mary Rose, a vessel he had known for over 30 years, heel over in a breeze as she turned to engage, take water through her open gun ports, and go down in minutes within sight of land. Around 500 men were aboard. Fewer than 40 came out. The rest were trapped under the anti-boarding netting stretched over her decks, a lattice designed to keep enemies out, that now held her own crew in while the water rose through it, and the accounts say the screaming carried clearly across the water to where the king stood. The wife of the ship's captain was standing near Henry as it happened, and fainted, and he caught and comforted her while his men drowned in front of them both, and was heard crying out for his gallant gentleman. Divers were hired, salvage was attempted, nothing worked, and the Mary Rose settled into the seabed with her drowned crew still netted inside her, where she stayed for 437 years. For a man raised to believe God's opinion of kings could be seen in events, the last years were composing a message, the son's dead, the body rotting, and now his favourite ship swallowed whole while he watched from a safe distance, able to do absolutely nothing, an audience at his own decline. At this point in his story, a reasonable person starts asking the obvious question: what was actually wrong with him? Doctors and historians have been arguing about it for the better part of 2 centuries, and I want to walk you through the main candidates the way you'd talk through them with a friend, laying out what supports each one and what cuts against it, and then you can make up your own mind. The honest answer is that nobody can settle it without opening his coffin. The oldest theory, and the one your grandparents may have absorbed as settled fact, is syphilis. The Victorians loved it. A lecherous king, rotting from the inside, his wife's dead babies, his festering sores, his ruined mind, the whole thing composes itself into a 19th century morality painting, and for a long time it went largely unchallenged. When you actually go into the records, though, the picture gets awkward for the theory. Tudor physicians knew the great pox intimately. It was everywhere in Europe, and they had a standard treatment for it. Long, brutal courses of mercury, weeks of salivation and sweating that left visible marks on a patient, and very legible marks in an apothecary's accounts. Henry's medical accounts survive in unusual detail, and mercury is nowhere in them. His contemporary Francis of France was dosed with it, and everyone knew. Henry's doctors bought herbs, wax, pearl for his plasters, everything under the sun, and no mercury. None of his children showed the signs physicians of the era could recognize of congenital syphilis. His ulcers sat on his legs, an odd address for the disease, and they hurt him terribly when the classic syphilitic lesion is famously painless. A senior surgeon at St. Bartholomew's went through all of this early in the 20th century and came down on the side of varicose ulcers torn open by injury, nothing venereal about them. The syphilis story tells you more about the Victorians than about Henry, but I'll leave the final vote to you. More modern medicine looks at the man, obese, immobile, gorging, and reaches first for the familiar suspects: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and vascular disease. On this account, his ulcers are venous, driven by ruined circulation in legs that carried too much weight and moved too little, and possibly diabetic. Healing badly for the same reasons a diabetic foot heals badly today. His fatigue, his fevers, his final decline slot in as the ordinary trajectory of a metabolic catastrophe that no one in 1546 had a name for. Nothing about that theory is exotic, and that is rather its strength. Others go a step further and suggest Cushing's syndrome, a disorder of cortisol that piles weight onto the torso and face while the limbs stay comparatively thin, weakens bone, wrecks blood sugar, and, in some patients, tips the mind toward paranoia and rage. Set the late Holbein portraits next to a clinical photograph of a Cushing's patient, the moon face, the massive trunk, and you can see why the idea found sponsors. A diagnosis from a painting is worth exactly what you paid for it, but the fit is interesting. Then a stranger candidate. In the late 1980s, a historian writing in History Today proposed scurvy, and before you laugh, the case is better than it sounds. A diet drowning in meat and wine and thin on fresh vegetables for months at a stretch, especially in Lent and late winter. Symptoms that flared seasonally, the swollen, useless legs, wounds that refuse to heal, stinking breath, black moods, lethargy. Scurvy does all of that, and it wrecks wound healing specifically, so it would feed the ulcers too. Against it, people point out that Henry loved fruit, that Catherine of Aragon had helped make oranges fashionable at his court, that a king could have any fresh thing in season carried to his table. Both things can be true across different months of a year, and the seasonal pattern in his illnesses is genuinely there in the record. Call it plausible, unproven, like most of this. Contemporaries, for their part, had their own vocabulary for what ailed him. Gout was widely assumed, the rich man's disease, the drinker's disease, and given his diet, it would be surprising if his joints had escaped it, though gout alone explains almost nothing else on the chart. Dropsy was another period favorite, the old word for the swelling of fluid retention, and his lower body in the final years was described in precisely those terms: grossly swollen legs on a failing frame, a sign physicians then took as a disease in itself, and doctors now recognize as the flag of a heart, liver, or kidneys giving out. And running under all the physical labels was the period's conviction that a disordered soul disordered the body, that grief, choler, and guilt could rot a man physically, and more than one observer implied that the king's afflictions matched the inside of the man. Their medicine was wrong about nearly everything, and on that last point you could argue they landed nearer the truth than they knew. The theory with the most reach arrived in 2010, in a peer-reviewed history journal from a bioarchaeologist and an anthropologist, and it tries to do something none of the others attempt: explain the dead babies and the ruined man with a single mechanism. Their proposal is that Henry carried a rare blood factor called Kell. When a Kell-positive man fathers children with a Kell-negative woman, the first pregnancy can go fine, but her immune system learns the foreign factor, and in later pregnancies, her antibodies cross the placenta and attack the baby's blood. The result is a signature pattern: an early child or two who live, followed by a string of late miscarriages, stillbirths, and newborns who die in days. Now line that up against Henry's marriages. Catherine of Aragon, at least 6 pregnancies, 1 surviving daughter, a son who lived 52 days, the rest dead before or just after birth. Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth I, then miscarriage after miscarriage. 2 healthy young women in succession, the same devastating pattern, a pattern their husband interpreted as God's verdict on his marriages and answered with annulment and a sword. If the Kell idea is right, the deaths that drove the divorce, the break with Rome, and Anne's execution were coming from his own blood the whole time. The same researchers went further. A small share of Kell-positive men go on to develop something called MacLeod syndrome, a degenerative condition that typically switches on around age 40, eroding the body and, in some cases, the mind, with paranoia and personality change on the published symptom list. Henry's collapse into tyranny gathers pace in his mid-40s. You can feel the pull of the theory. You should also hear the pushback. Other scholars have gone through the family pedigree and the symptom record and found the MacLeod half of it a poor fit. His mind stayed sharp in ways that syndrome usually erodes, and the whole edifice rests on a blood test nobody can run. It would take his DNA to settle, and his DNA is soldered inside a coffin under the floor of a royal chapel, and the family that owns the chapel has shown no enthusiasm whatsoever for cracking it open. So the argument continues over a locked vault, and perhaps that is the fitting place for it. One more candidate has a seat at the table, and we've met it already: the brain. Take the 1524 lance to the head, add whatever happened in those 2 disputed hours at Greenwich in 1536, sprinkle in a couple of decades of headaches, and you have the modern traumatic brain injury case, the one the neurologists published, the one that would explain the memory lapses, the volcanic mood swings, the impulsivity of his last decade without needing any exotic blood factor at all. It stacks perfectly well on top of the diabetes or the Cushing's or the Kell theory. None of these exclude the others. The likeliest truth, if you want my private lean, and take it as exactly that, is a pile-up. A damaged brain in a failing body, vascular disease feeding the ulcers, some metabolic disaster feeding everything else. All of it compounding for 11 years in a man with absolute power and no one able to tell him no. Whatever the labels, the lived experience is not in dispute, and the lived experience is the story. Constant pain, constant stench, a body he could feel dying around him, decades of it, and a court full of people watching it happen while swearing to his face that he looked well. Whatever engine was driving it, the last decade of Henry's reign was governed by a mind his own servants no longer recognized. The generous prince who had laughed off a lance to the face in 1524 had become a man who could sign a death warrant before dinner and weep about it after, or forget it entirely. The memory lapses are documented in ways that would be funny in a private citizen and are terrifying in an absolute monarch. In 1546, he flew into a rage at the guards who arrived to arrest his own wife, apparently having lost track of the fact that he had approved the arrest himself the day before. His moods swung between hours. Marillac, the French ambassador, filled his private letters home with it. The suspicion, above all, the observation that this was a king so distrustful, he committed the same matter to different ministers and watched to see whose account differed. And the regret, that too. In 1540, Henry sent Thomas Cromwell, the most capable servant he ever had, to the block on Tower Hill on charges concocted by Cromwell's enemies, and the execution itself went horribly. A young headsman, a botched first stroke, several blows to finish a man who had run England for a decade. Within months, Henry was openly mourning him, telling people that on the pretext of trifling offences, his counsellors had made him destroy the most faithful servant he ever had. He blamed the men around him. He always blamed the men around him. The signature on the warrant was his. By then the whole kingdom could see the decay for themselves, in miniature, every time money changed hands. The war in France had drained the treasury, and the crown's answer was to debase the coinage, mixing cheap copper into the silver shillings. The new coins were struck with the king's aging, heavy-jowled portrait facing outward, and the silver wash was thinnest on the highest point of the design, the tip of the royal nose, so as the coins passed from purse to purse, the silver rubbed away there first, and the copper showed through, red-brown, right on the face. The people gave their king a nickname for it: Old Copper Nose. Every market stall in England was handling little portraits of Henry with his nose rotting to copper, and every subject who received one in change got a daily reminder that both the currency and the man on it had less precious metal in them than advertised. Inside the palace, meanwhile, honesty had narrowed to a single licensed channel: the fool. Will Somers, the king's jester, held a position stranger than any minister's, the one man whose job description included saying true things, within limits he had to feel for constantly, to a ruler nobody else dared contradict. He appears in a royal family portrait of the 1540s, tucked into the background, closer to the king in paint than most dukes ever got in life. Somers reportedly could ease Henry out of moods no physician could touch, and a fair measure of the man's isolation is that in the final years, the short list of people who told Henry VIII the truth may have consisted of a professional clown and eventually one servant with a message about death. Living near that temper became a survivable skill, and the crown made sure the stakes were written into law. Under the treason legislation of his reign, it was a capital offence to foretell or compass the death of the king. Prophesying that Henry would die, even discussing when he might, could end with you hanged, drawn and quartered, and this was enforced against absolute nobodies. In 1538, a York widow and servant named Mabel Brigg undertook what was called a black fast, a folk ritual of fasting directed against a person. In this case, the accusation ran against the king and the Duke of Norfolk. For fasting at him, in effect, for wishing him dead with her hunger, she was tried and executed. The same year, a man named Thomas Barry, who had spread a rumour that the king was already dead, stood in the pillory at Newbury for it and, the report goes, died there of shock with his ears nailed to the boards. True in every detail or embroidered in the telling, stories like that did their work. England learned that the king's mortality was a forbidden subject. That law will hang over the deathbed, and it turns the final scene of this story into something close to black comedy. The men standing around the dying Henry in January 1547 had spent years watching people destroyed for saying the king would die. Now the king was visibly dying, and someone would eventually have to inform him, and the sentence for being wrong, or early, or simply resented for it, was the traitor's death. Medicine had failed him completely by then. The law had gone further and made the truth itself a crime. The body's collapse had invaded the marriage bed too, and in 1540 it produced the most publicly humiliating episode of his life. The marriage to Anne of Cleves, his fourth, arranged for diplomacy off the strength of a flattering portrait, fell apart on contact. Henry took against her from their first, botched meeting and never recovered, and when the annulment proceedings came 6 months later, the intimate details went into sworn depositions that survive for anyone to consult. The king had been unable to consummate the marriage. His own explanation, given to his doctors and repeated by them under oath, was that the fault lay entirely with her body. And in a detail that shows how anxious the whole court knew this subject to be, his physician testified that the king had assured him he remained perfectly capable, describing his experiences in his sleep, evidence formally entered to establish that the failure was hers and never his. A 49-year-old man with suppurating legs and a 50-inch waist, requiring his doctor to certify his virility into the legal record of Europe. Anne, to her enormous credit and good fortune, took the settlement, the houses, the status of the king's beloved sister, and outlived every other person in this story. But the depositions sat there in the archive, and the ambassadors traded the details, and the aging king knew they did, and his response to the humiliation arrived within weeks, in the shape of a girl of about 19. His marriages in these years ran on the same current of menace. Catherine Howard, the teenager he married in 1540, in the full flush of an old man's infatuation, calling her his rose without a thorn, was beheaded in February 1542, aged perhaps 19 or 20, after her past, and her conduct came apart under investigation. The night before her execution, she asked for the block to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head on it, and that detail alone has kept her in people's memory for 5 centuries. Henry's grief was real. The ambassadors describe him weeping before his council, and it changed nothing about the outcome, and both of those facts belong in the same sentence when you weigh the man. His 6th wife, Catherine Parr, a clever widow in her early 30s, took the position knowing precisely what had happened to numbers 2 and 5, and nursed him, and debated scripture with him, and very nearly joined the list anyway. In 1546, the conservative faction at court, led by Bishop Gardiner, worked the aging king against her, whispering that the Queen's evangelical opinions shaded into heresy, and Henry let them draw up articles against her and a warrant for her arrest. A copy of the warrant, by chance or by a friend's design, reached Catherine. She collapsed with terror, audibly enough that the king heard of it, and then she pulled off one of the most precise performances of the age. She went to him, and when he tested her with theological talk, she told him that a woman's role was to learn from her husband, that she had only ever argued divinity with him to distract him from the pain of his leg and to profit from his answers. His recorded reply was warm, and then Chancellor Wriothesley arrived the next day with 40 guards to take her, on schedule, to the Tower, and Henry, either forgetting his own warrant or savouring the reversal, drove him off with a stream of abuse: knave, arrant knave, beast, and fool. The Queen survived. She had talked her way out from under the axe with the pain of his leg as her alibi. And if you want a single image of what marriage to the final Henry meant, that is the one. A wife measuring her theology against her husband's rotting shin and betting her neck on the calculation. Autumn of 1546 opens the final descent. The king had been visibly failing since the year before. That spring he had been too ill for weeks to travel. Through the summer he rallied enough for appearances, and the government machine papered over the gaps. But in September, and again in December, fevers took hold of him that his doctors traced, in the phrase the council used with foreign envoys, to some grief of his leg. Grief of his leg. Bureaucratic language for the same wound that had turned him black-faced in 1538, closing and festering and flooding him with infection. In December, he came back to Whitehall from the countryside, and the court noticed things that frightened them. The Queen was sent away to Greenwich for Christmas, apart from him. Most of the household was thinned out. The palace contracted around one overheated sick room, and the men allowed inside that perimeter, Denny, Paget, Hertford, a handful of others, effectively became the government of England, controlling who saw the king, what he signed, and what the world was told. His signature itself had already been outsourced. A dry stamp of his sign manual, applied to documents by trusted hands and inked in afterward, because the actual hand of the actual king could no longer reliably hold a pen through the volume of state business. Every safeguard against forging a king's will was, by January, in the physical possession of the men who stood to profit from its contents. One absence hung over that final sick room. Dr. William Butts, the physician Henry actually trusted, the one man of medicine who had been with him for decades and could manage the royal body and, rarer still, the royal temper, had died in November 1545, and the difference showed. Butts had been more than a doctor. He had been a back channel, the man courtiers approached to plant a word with the king at a receptive moment, credited with helping save Cranmer from his enemies, skilled at delivering unwelcome medical truths wrapped in enough tact to survive them. The physicians who remained were competent and careful, and none of them had his standing. And you can feel the difference in the last year, a patient managed rather than known. A royal doctor's position at a deathbed was, on top of everything else, professionally perilous. King's physicians throughout history had faced ruin, or worse, when their patient died under their care. And these men were tending a patient whose death it was treason to predict, on treatments that did not work, for a disease they could not name. Small wonder the room went quiet, and the plasters kept coming. Medicine had nothing left. Candor was illegal, and the man in the bed had a lifetime's record of destroying bearers of unwelcome news. Every incentive in that chamber pointed towards silence, right up until Denny broke it. Even from the bottom of that decline, the old reflexes could still kill. In December 1546, the Crown arrested the Duke of Norfolk and his son Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, the premier noble family in England. Surrey was about 30, arrogant beyond all sense, and one of the finest poets in the language, one of the two men who brought the sonnet into English. His offence, dressed in legal language, was heraldry. He had quartered the royal arms into his own coat in a way the crown chose to see as a claim on the throne, while a child heir waited in the wings. Ambition, vanity, and a dying king's paranoia met in the worst possible month. From his cell in the tower, Surrey attempted one of the more desperate escapes in the building's long history, the plan being to climb down the shaft of his own privy at low tide, out through the filth, to a boat on the river. His servant was to meet him. The attempt failed. He was caught at the mouth of the shaft, and after that they watched him properly. At his trial on January the 13th, 1547, he defended himself for hours, brilliant and doomed, and the verdict came back the way verdicts came back in that reign. On January the 19th, he was beheaded on Tower Hill, the last of the many, many people executed on the order of Henry VIII. In the tower beforehand, he had been translating psalms, the ones about betrayal and abandonment, turning David's complaints against faithless princes into English verse, a few yards from the scaffold being kept warm for him. His father, the Duke, old Norfolk, who had survived every purge of the reign by betraying whoever needed betraying, including two of his own nieces who were queens, was attainted and scheduled to follow his son to the block on the morning of January the 28th. Note the date. The axe was booked. The paperwork was moving. And upstairs at Whitehall, the man whose signature drove all of it was running out of hours faster than his own executioner's schedule. Through those same weeks, the diplomats were scratching at the closed doors and getting nowhere. The imperial ambassador, van der Delft, wrote to his master that there was very little communication because of the indisposition of the king, that the illness prevented all access. Around the middle of January, the sick room managed one final performance. Henry received the ambassadors, propped and prepared, and carried it off well enough that the French envoys reported him fairly well, and van der Delft recorded the king telling him that he had suffered and passed through a great deal since they had last met. A dying man's understatement, delivered with the old charm. He knew. On some level, whatever the law forbade anyone from saying, the body had been telling him for months. On the 26th of December, he had already summoned Hertford, Paget, Denny and the rest in the night, called for his will, gone through the list of executors and struck out Bishop Gardiner with his own decision, calling him a willful man, not fit to govern his son. One last flash of the old political brain, sorting the men who would run England for the boy. The will was finalized and witnessed on the 30th. The stamp, the will, the guarded door, the thinned household. Everything was in place for the ending, and everyone inside that perimeter knew it, and by the letter of the law, not one of them could say so. Thursday, January the 27th, 1547. By the evening, the physicians around the bed had reached their private verdict. The king would not see many more sunrises, possibly not one. And then came the moment the treason law had been building toward for a decade. Somebody had to tell him. The doctors would not do it. Informing the king of his own death sat far too close to foretelling it, and men had been gutted alive for less. The councillors found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. In the end, the task fell to the man whose whole office was the king's body, Sir Anthony Denny, the chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, the keeper of the dry stamp, the closest thing the dying man had to an honest friend in the room. Our account of what followed comes mainly from John Fox, writing about 25 years later, from the recollections of people who were there. So hold it, the way you hold any deathbed narrative polished by a generation of retelling. But here is what it says. Denny came to the bedside, boldly. The account emphasizes, and bold is the right word, and told the king plainly that in man's judgment he was not likely to live, and that he should remember his sins and call upon God through Christ. A servant telling Henry VIII to prepare to die, with the Treason Act hanging in the air between them. The king took it. Whatever else had rotted, the courage had not. He answered that the mercy of Christ was able to pardon him all his sins, yes, though they were greater than they be. Even softened by Fox's Protestant Polish, that reply has a strange, exhausted magnificence to it, though they were greater than they be. He knew the size of his own ledger. Denny asked whether he wished to speak with any learned man. Henry named Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had annulled his first marriage, buried several of his queens, and somehow survived 20 years of him. But first, the king said, he would take a little sleep, and then, as he felt himself, he would advise upon the matter. He went to sleep. An hour or two later, he woke feeling his strength going and said, "Send for Cranmer." The Archbishop was at Croydon, a dozen miles of frozen January road away, and the ride took hours through the ice and dark. Inside the chamber, the king's speech went first. By the time Cranmer got to the bedside, somewhere past midnight, Henry could no longer talk. The Archbishop knelt over him, took his hand, and asked him for some sign, any sign, that he put his trust in Christ. What happened next is the whole scene, and it is very small. The dying king wrung Cranmer's hand as hard as he could. That grip was the last recorded act of Henry VIII. Whatever passed between those two men in that squeeze, absolution, friendship, terror, nobody can ever know, but Cranmer took it for faith, and shortly afterward, at around 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday, January the 28th, 1547, the king stopped breathing. He was 55 years old. He died in the dark, mute, gripping the hand of the archbishop in a palace where announcing his death remained, at that exact moment, a crime punishable by disembowelment. The Earl of Sussex, writing to a correspondent days later, dated it plainly, "Departed at Westminster upon Friday last, about 2 of the clock in the morning." A modern biographer of his final years sums the physical cause as probably renal and liver failure riding on top of everything else. The obesity, the ulcers, the years of infection, a body that had been dying by inches since Greenwich finally finishing the job all at once. 2 ghost stories attach themselves to that bedside later, and you will run into both of them online. The first has him crying out, "Monks, monks, monks," with his last breath, haunted by the ruins of the 600 religious houses he had emptied and the men he had hanged from their own gate towers. Trace that quote backward and you land in the 19th century, in the pages of the Victorian writer Agnes Strickland, who describes him afflicted with visionary horrors, eyes rolling toward the dark corners of the chamber. No one standing in the actual room in 1547 left any record of it, and by every contemporary account, he could not speak at all in his final hours. The second story has him calling for Jane Seymour, the third wife, the one who gave him his son and died for it, the one he chose to be buried beside. That one has no contemporary source either. Both stories survive because they are better theatre than the truth, and the truth is quieter and, to my ear, worse. A huge ruined body in a bed, a squeezed hand, and silence from a man who had spent 40 years making sure his voice was the loudest thing in England. And now we are back where this video began, at the locked door and the trumpets, and you can finally see the machinery behind that scene. The moment the king died, the men in the room had a problem of succession mechanics. The heir, Edward, was 9 years old and miles away. The will named a council of regency, but wills can be contested, boys can be seized, and vacuums like January 1547 had started civil wars within living memory. So Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the boy's uncle, and William Paget, the late King's secretary, made a decision in the hours before dawn, reportedly pacing the gallery outside the death chamber while the body cooled inside. Nobody would be told. The ports were sealed so that no ship could carry the news abroad. Parliament sat on as if nothing had happened, and at every mealtime for 3 days, the full ritual of feeding the King of England was performed for his corpse. Dishes carried to the chamber with the trumpet fanfare. The whole theatre of a living monarch staged daily by men who had watched him die, several of whom had spent the previous decade learning how dangerous it was to discuss this man's death prematurely, and were now, in a twist, none of them had time to savour, legally obliged to lie about it having happened at all. Vanderdelft, the imperial ambassador, smelled something within a day and wrote home that he had learned from a very confidential source that the king was dead, while noting, with professional admiration you can feel through the ink, that not the slightest sign of it showed at court, and even the ceremony of bearing in the royal dishes to the sound of trumpets was continuing without interruption. Hertford, meanwhile, was riding hard out of London to secure the person of the boy king. Possession of Edward was possession of England, and by the time the public learned anything, the uncle had the nephew, and the Regency Council, named in the will, had quietly rearranged itself with Hertford at its head, soon to be Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. The old Duke of Norfolk, sitting in the Tower with his execution scheduled for that very Friday morning, simply never heard the footsteps come. The council decided the new reign should not open with the killing of England's senior peer, so the axe stayed up, and the man Henry meant to kill on the day he died outlived him by 7 years. Saved by the clock. Of all the thousands of death warrants in that reign, the last one was cancelled by the death of the hand that signed it. On Monday, January the 31st, they finally said it out loud. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley stood before Parliament and announced the death of the king. And the account says he wept as he spoke, which may have been grief, or may simply have been the relief of a man finally permitted to state a fact. Edward VI was proclaimed. Bells, heralds, the machinery of a new reign lurching into motion. Somewhere north of London in those same hours, the news performed its most painful errand. The new king, 9-year-old Edward, had been collected by his uncle and brought to Enfield, where his 13-year-old sister Elizabeth was living, and the two children were told together, deliberately together, that their father was dead. The account that survives says they clung to each other and sobbed so bitterly that the adults in the room, hardened men in the middle of a coup, broke down with them. Whatever Henry VIII was to England, to a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, he was simply their father, enormous, terrifying, occasionally warm, the sun their whole world had orbited, and one of the two children sobbing hardest had been declared a bastard by the man they were crying for. Mary, at 30, grieved in her own way, and had more to grieve since her father had broken her mother, broken her church, and forced her under threat to sign away her own legitimacy, and she seems to have mourned him anyway, in the immovable manner of daughters. All 3 of them would wear his crown, all 3 would die childless, and the dynasty he had wrecked his kingdom and his marriages and arguably his soul to secure would be extinct within 56 years of that morning at Enfield. Behind all of it, at Whitehall, another kind of work had already been going on for 3 days, and this is where the story gets physical again, and the handling of Henry's body from here to the grave is where the grotesque earns its place in the title. The embalmers faced a practical problem. A man of roughly 28 stone, dead of massive systemic infection, with open ulcerated wounds on his legs, in an age with no refrigeration, who would need to lie in state for a week and a half and then travel 25 miles by road in a coffin. The surgeons and apothecaries and wax chandlers went to work on him within days, and the funeral accounts, kept with the Society of Antiquaries, use a string of blunt period verbs for what they did. The body was spurged, cleansed, boweled, seared, embalmed, furnished with spices. Boweled means what you think it means. They opened the enormous abdomen and removed the entrails and organs, the parts that rot first, and those pieces of Henry VIII were buried separately, quietly, in the chapel at Whitehall, meaning that strictly speaking part of him never made it to Windsor at all. What remained was packed and treated with spices and resins, wrapped in waxed cloth, seared, sheet after sheet of fabric stiffened with wax molded around the body, and then the whole package was sealed inside a coffin of soldered metal, built to contain a giant, nearly 7 feet of it, encased again in wood. The plumbers, the men who worked soft metal, soldered him in. That sealed shell was the plan, the engineering answer to the question of how you move a decomposing colossus across a county with dignity. The specifications, taken together, were these: a body full of infection, imperfectly preserved by 16th century methods, generating, as all such bodies do, gas, pressure and fluid, inside a rigid sealed container, about to spend 2 days being jolted over frozen winter roads. 16th century engineering was about to meet 16th century biology, and biology, as usual, had the last word. For a week and a half he lay in state in the chapel at Whitehall, the coffin under a pall of cloth of gold, tapers burning day and night, 80 of them by some counts, masses sung in a continuous rotation, and mourners filing through while a herald called on them, of your charity, to pray for the soul of the Most High and Mighty Prince. The officers of arms stood their turns about the bier in their tabards day and night in rotation, and so the palace that had spent 3 days pretending the king was alive now settled into a week and a half of formally proclaiming at scheduled intervals that he was dead. Ceremony had swung from concealing the fact to announcing it on the clock. The mourning spread outward on orders too. Parishes across the realm were directed to sing dirges and requiem masses for the late king, so for those weeks the whole of England was, on paper, praying for Henry's soul, bells going from thousands of towers, and mixed in among the genuinely grieving stood congregations praying on command for the man who had hanged their abbot, or pulled down their local shrine, mouthing the charity the law required. What any given parishioner privately asked God for that week went unrecorded. The prayers of charity went up over a sealed box, while, down the corridor, the men he had made rich divided his offices among themselves. Then, on February the 14th, the procession formed up for Windsor. The funeral procession of Henry VIII was the largest England had staged in living memory, and the accounts kept count. The column stretched, by report, some 4 miles along the Winter Road, more than 1,000 men on horseback and hundreds more on foot, banners, crosses, choirs, the entire chapel royal singing as it walked. 250 poor men in mourning gowns carried torches at the front, paid for their grief by the yard of black cloth. The roads between London and Windsor had been repaired in advance for the wheels, and workmen had gone ahead cutting back overhanging branches so the tall banners could pass without snagging, a kingdom literally trimming its trees for one man's last journey. At the centre rolled the funeral chariot, drawn by 8 horses draped to the ground in black velvet, each ridden by a child of honour, and on the chariot lay the sealed coffin, And on top of the coffin lay something that unsettled almost everyone who described it, a full-size wax and wood effigy of the king, dressed in crimson velvet furred with ermine, a crown of imperial state on its head, rings on its fingers, a scepter in its hand, the face modelled so closely to life that people along the route, seeing it pass above them, doffed their caps and knelt as though Henry were riding by alive. One observer wrote that the effigy showed the king exactly as if he were breathing. So for 2 days, England watched a lifelike Henry ride in glory on top of the box that held the real one, the sealed metal shell with the ruined giant inside, and the gap between those two passengers. The king they built and the king they carried is about as clean a summary of his whole reign as anyone has ever managed. The march itself, before Syon, had its own texture. The column left London in the dark of early morning, February the 14th, moving out through streets where Londoners stood muffled against the cold to watch it pass, and the accounts describe the sound of it as much as the sight, the slow drums, the tolling of every church bell along the route, parish after parish, handing the sound to the next, the singing of the priests rising and falling over 4 miles of road. 250 poor men walked at the head carrying long torches, recruited for the occasion, their mourning gowns cut from thousands of yards of black cloth the wardrobe had bought up, an outlay so large it reportedly stripped the market. The Marquis of Dorset rode as chief mourner. Behind the chariot came the king's riderless charger, led at a walk, the old signal of a fallen master. At the boundary of each town, local clergy came out in their vestments to cense the coffin as it passed, swinging smoke over the sealed metal, so the effigy in its crown rode through a fog of incense while the bells hammered overhead. People knelt in the frozen mud. Some wept, and it would be a mistake to assume none of it was sincere. He had reigned for 37 years. Most people in those crowds had never drawn breath under another king, and the ones weeping for a tyrant and the ones weeping for the only England they had ever known were standing shoulder to shoulder and indistinguishable. The first day's march ended at Syon, and if the name rings a bell from earlier Tudor stories, it should. Syon had been a great abbey of Brigittine nuns, one of the most respected religious houses in England, until Henry's dissolution smashed it and scattered its community and took the buildings for the crown. More recently, it had served the king as a prison. Catherine Howard, his 5th wife, was held at Syon through the winter of 1541 into 42, and it was from Syon that she was rowed downriver to the Tower to die, 5 years, almost to the week, before her husband's coffin came up the same road to spend the night in the same confiscated house. On the evening of February the 14th, the coffin was carried into the chapel there, set up on its platform surrounded by tapers, the watch was posted, and the great column bedded down around the ruins of the abbey he had destroyed. What happened in that chapel overnight became the most notorious scene in this entire story, and you can sit in judgment on it yourselves once the pieces are on the table. The story goes like this. During the night, the coffin failed. The jolting of the road, the pressure building inside, the sheer strained mass of the body. Something gave, the soldered seams cracked or the metal split, and matter from the corpse, blood and other liquid leaked out onto the platform and down to the floor of the chapel. In the morning, when the plumbers were brought in to resolder the casket, a dog was found under the bier, licking up what had seeped from the King of England. One version names a witness, a man who said he had driven the dog away, and pairs him with the plumber whose hands did the repair. The detail that made the story immortal, though, had been set up 15 years in advance. Back in 1532, on Easter Sunday, a Franciscan friar named William Peto had stood up in the chapel at Greenwich, directly in front of Henry and Anne Boleyn, and preached against the divorce with a courage verging on suicidal. He compared the king to Ahab, the Old Testament tyrant married to Jezebel, and warned him to his face that if he went on as he was, the dogs would lick his blood as they had licked Ahab's. Ahab, in the Book of Kings, dies of his wounds, and when they wash out his chariot, the dogs lick up his blood just as the prophet had promised. So when the Syon story began to circulate, England already had the prophecy on file. The friar had called it, the abbey the king ruined had hosted it, the wife he beheaded had been imprisoned in the very building, and heaven, on this telling, had arranged the payoff with a novelist's sense of timing. Now the receipts. The sourcing here is the whole question. Nobody who marched in that procession, and the heralds documented it almost hour by hour, left a surviving contemporary account of a burst coffin and a dog. The earliest full telling in print arrives over 130 years later, in 1679, in Gilbert Burnet's History of the Reformation, an author writing with an agenda and at a very long distance. The Victorian writer Agnes Strickland later gave it the version everyone quotes, complete with a trembling narrator, the pavement wetted with blood, the plumbers at their soldering, the dog creeping underfoot, and she claimed to be drawing on an old manuscript account. Set against that, the physical side of the story asks for no miracle at all. Sealed coffins of the period did split under the pressure of decomposition. Grave diggers and church records from the era complain about it, and this particular coffin held an enormous infection-riddled body, imperfectly embalmed, 10 days dead, freshly shaken over 20 miles of frozen ruts. Plumbers attending to the casket at Syon would have been an unremarkable maintenance call. A stray dog in a half-ruined abbey full of 1,000 camped travellers would have surprised no one. So you have a late-arriving story with a suspiciously perfect prophecy attached, describing an event that contemporary science considers entirely plausible at a location dripping with poetic justice. Weigh it however you like. What I will say is that the people who spread the tale in the following century did so with relish, because to them it was scripture landing on schedule. The dogs collecting the debt the friar had announced in 1532, and whether or not a dog's tongue ever actually touched what came out of that coffin, the fact that England found the image believable shows what England had come to think of him. Whatever leaked or didn't leak at Syon, the repaired coffin rolled on the next morning, February the 15th, and covered the second stage to Windsor. The town turned out to receive him. The mayor and brethren of Windsor waited at the boundary with the parish clergy. Poor men of the town knelt along the last climb toward the castle, holding torches against the February dark. And at the door of St. George's Chapel, the college of priests stood vested and censing while the yeoman took the strain and carried the coffin up the steps, the crowned effigy borne behind it under a canopy, wax royalty following metal-boxed royalty into the church. Inside, the whole apparatus was set up under an enormous candle-lit hearse, a towering framework of wax lights 35 feet high, said to hold thousands of candles, built over the bier so that the coffin lay inside a burning architecture of its own. Masses ran through the day and night. The overnight vigil of the 15th into the 16th carried a strangeness that nobody kneeling in that chapel could have missed. Officers and gentlemen kept watch in shifts around the blazing hearse through the small hours, while the wax ran down the 35-foot frame and the choir worked through the full ancient liturgy for the dead, dirges in the darkness, and in the morning 3 solemn masses sung in succession by bishops in full pontificals. Every rite performed over Henry VIII that night was Catholic to its bones. Banners of saints stood around the coffin. Priests prayed for his soul's passage through purgatory, the very doctrine his own propagandists had spent a decade undermining. The man under the cloth of gold had severed England from Rome, hanged monks from their own gatehouses, stripped the shrines of the saints whose painted images now kept watch over his corpse, and yet he had died, by his own lights, a good Catholic, just one with himself in charge, and his funeral was the last great performance of the old faith over an English king. Within 2 years, his son's government would outlaw nearly every prayer said for him that night. The men singing for his soul were performing a liturgy that was dying along with the master of it, and some of them surely sensed as much, and sang anyway into the candle smoke, for a king who had made the words themselves dangerous and then required them at his own grave. The effigy stood close by through all of it, crowned and sceptered, its glass gaze catching the candlelight, the wax king presiding over the prayers for the real one. Then, on the morning of February the 16th, they buried him, and every detail of the ceremony carries its own charge. The requiem was sung and the sermon preached by Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, the same willful man Henry had personally struck off the list of his executors 6 weeks earlier, judged unfit to help govern the son, yet still, by rank and ritual, the right man to pray the Father into the ground. Gardiner preached on the text, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord," and observers noted his tears, and you may decide for yourself what proportion of them belonged to the king, and what proportion to the office he had just been denied. Up in the Queen's closet, screened from the congregation, Catherine Parr watched the whole thing from above, dressed in blue, the colour of royal mourning, a widow for the 3rd time at 34, the woman who had held that leg in her lap and talked him down from his pain, and nearly gone to the block for her trouble, looking down on the box that ended it. Getting him into the ground was itself a feat of labour. The vault, a small brick chamber under the floor of the choir, had been opened, and inside it, waiting for almost 10 years, lay Jane Seymour, wife number 3, the mother of Edward, the one who died 12 days after giving Henry the son he had torn Christendom apart to get, and, surely not by coincidence, the only one of the 6 who never had the chance to disappoint him. He had chosen this spot himself. Of all the women, the one he elected to lie beside for eternity was the one death had preserved at the exact moment of her triumph. The coffin was borne to the vault mouth, and it took 16 tall yeomen of the guard, working with 5 strong linen towels threaded beneath the metal, to take the strain and lower the King of England into the floor. 16 of the biggest men in the country straining against the dead weight of what he had become. Earth was cast onto the coffin. And then the officers of his household performed the gesture that closed a Tudor reign, each man stepping forward in turn, breaking his white staff of office over his head, and hurling the pieces down into the vault onto the coffin, the physical snapping of every chain of service that had bound them to this master. The wands clattered down onto the metal in the candlelight. Garter, King of Arms, cried the style of the new king. The trumpets sounded in the choir, and the congregation walked out of the chapel into the winter morning as servants of a 9-year-old boy. Under the floor behind them, the giant lay next to the girl who had died making his heir, and the stone went back over both of them. The plan, and he had left detailed plans, was that this would be temporary. Henry had designed himself a tomb to end all tombs, and in classic Henry fashion, he had acquired the raw materials by confiscation, taking over the magnificent monument that Cardinal Wolsey had commissioned for himself before his fall, a gleaming black stone sarcophagus and bronze work by Italian masters, and ordering it enlarged into something without precedent in England. The specifications survive: a raised platform, the sarcophagus aloft, a gilded life-size effigy of the king, columns crowned with statues of the apostles, candlesticks 9 feet tall, bronze friezes, the whole thing to tower over the chapel and instruct eternity on his magnificence. His will directed his executors to finish it. His will also directed a perpetual foundation of priests at Windsor to say daily masses for his soul while the world endured, with money for the poor to pray for him forever on a schedule. What his heirs actually did with all of that is its own dark comedy. The masses for his soul ran for about a year before his son's government, driving forward the Protestant Reformation. Henry's own choices had abolished the entire theology of praying for the dead, and the perpetual foundation evaporated. While the world endured turned out to mean roughly 18 months. The tomb fared no better. The executors were instantly consumed by the power struggle he had left behind, and money for a dead man's monument kept losing out to the needs of living men's ambitions. His daughter Mary reigned 5 years and left the tomb untouched. Elizabeth reigned 45 years and did essentially nothing, and the unfinished components sat in the chapel and then in storage, gathering dust for a full century until the 1640s, when a revolutionary parliament at war with the crown simply sold the bronze for cash. 4 of the great candlesticks eventually surfaced across the sea in a cathedral in Ghent, where they stand today, lighting services for Belgian congregations who mostly have no idea they are looking at pieces of Henry VIII's funeral furniture. And the black stone sarcophagus, the centerpiece, the actual vessel meant to hold his glorified remains above the heads of posterity, sat empty in a chapel at Windsor for 2.5 centuries until the government found a use for it in 1805. They gave it to Admiral Nelson. Walk into the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral in London today, and you will see the hero of Trafalgar lying in state inside Henry VIII's tomb, with Wolsey's sarcophagus under him, three men's ambitions stacked like sediment, and the king who commissioned the arrangement still lying under a bare floor at Windsor, in the brick vault that was supposed to be a short-term measure, where he has now been waiting for the movers for very nearly 500 years. The news, once released, moved across Europe like weather, and it broke over one man in particular with an effect people talked about for years. Francis I of France, Henry's lifelong rival, his mirror, the king he had wrestled at the field of cloth of gold and measured his calves against through 3 decades of intertwined vanity, was himself a sick man by 1547, wasted by a long internal illness his doctors could not name. When word of Henry's death reached him, the reports say he took it badly, brooded on it, remarked on the strangeness of it, and some at his court claimed afterward that he had once exchanged with Henry a half-serious understanding that whichever of them died first, the other would soon follow. Whether that pact was ever really spoken or was invented afterward to decorate the coincidence itself is on the record. Francis I died on the last day of March 1547, 62 days after Henry, and the two men who had spent their entire adult lives circling each other, outbuilding, outdressing, outspending, occasionally outwarring one another, went into their tombs in the same season, as if the rivalry had been the thing keeping them both upright. The generation of giant kings closed in a single winter and spring, and all across Europe, chancelleries adjusted to a continent suddenly run by children and regents. As for the men who had staged the 3-day pantomime with the trumpets, the ones who inherited the country he left, the vortex Henry created did not stop spinning just because he had climbed out of it. Edward Seymour, the uncle who rode through the January night to seize the boy king and made himself Lord Protector, lasted about 5 years before the political machine he had captured turned on him, and in 1552 he was beheaded on Tower Hill in front of an enormous, largely sympathetic crowd. His own brother, Thomas Seymour, had gone to the block 3 years before that, condemned with the Protector's consent. Brother signing off on brother, a piece of family business that would have drawn a nod of professional recognition from their late master. Thomas's story loops through this one in a particularly grim way, because within months of Henry's funeral he had secretly married the widowed Catherine Parr, the 4th husband for the woman who had survived the most dangerous marriage in England. And she died in September 1548, days after giving birth to her only child, of the childbed fever that killed queens and farm wives alike. 36 years old. She had outlived Henry by barely 20 months, and the freedom she had earned by nursing him through his rot bought her almost nothing. Even old Norfolk, the man saved by the clock, came out of the Tower in 1553 under Queen Mary, and died in his bed at 80, having outlasted the king who condemned him, the protector who kept him locked up, and most of his own family, one of the very few people in this entire story who beat the house. The vault at Windsor, meanwhile, settled into a strange afterlife of its own, and the next chapter of Henry's story happens entirely underground, to a man with no idea he was still accumulating roommates. In 1649, 102 years after his burial, England cut off the head of another king. Charles I, tried and executed by his own parliament on a January morning, needed a grave, and London was judged too dangerous, too likely to produce either a shrine or a desecration. So the small funeral party brought him quietly to Windsor through a snowfall, and when they went looking for a suitable place in St. George's Chapel, someone tapping the choir floor found a hollow, and they opened it, and found themselves looking down into a forgotten brick chamber holding two decayed coffins, a large one and a smaller one. The chamber itself was modest, low, roughly the size of a small cellar, a strange economy of space for a man who had built and seized more palaces than any English king before or since. Henry and Jane. The vault's location had literally slipped from institutional memory in a century of religious upheaval, the most famous king in English history misplaced under the floor of his own chapel. The burial party lowered Charles's coffin, with his severed head loosely in place, into the space beside Henry's, on the dead king's left, and closed the floor again. And one of the era's darker minds might have appreciated the arrangement, the king who broke the church and the king broken by its consequences, lying side by side in the dark, close enough to touch. A small velvet-covered coffin joined them decades later, a stillborn child of Queen Anne's tucked into the corner of the chamber. And then the floor stayed shut, and the memory blurred once more, and generations walked over the four of them without certainty about what lay beneath, until the 19th century arrived with shovels. In 1813, workmen building a passage to a new royal burial chamber under the chapel broke, by accident, through the wall of the old vault. Word went up the chain, and the chain in this case ended at the top, because on the 1st of April 1813, the Prince Regent himself, the future George IV, came down into the tomb of Henry VIII with a small party, the Dean of Windsor, and the royal physician, Sir Henry Halford, who left a written account of everything they did, and everything they did is the reason we know what the inside of that vault looks like. Their main interest, in fairness, was the other king. Royalists and skeptics had argued for generations about whether Charles I was really at Windsor at all, and here was a chance to settle it. They opened the plain coffin, cut through the wrappings, and found themselves looking into a face. The embalming had held well enough that the long oval visage of the Stuart king was recognizable at a glance from his portraits, the pointed beard still on the chin, one eye, by Halford's account, open and full for the first instant of exposure before the air began its work. When they lifted the head, it came away freely in the physician's hands, and Halford examined the neck vertebra and found the surface cut smoothly through, the plane of a heavy blade, the stroke of January 1649 preserved in the bone. Identification settled beyond argument, and then Sir Henry Halford, President of the Royal College of Physicians, attending doctor to the royal family, did something that marks the 19th century as its own kind of grave robber. He kept the vertebra, took it home, along with, by various accounts, a tooth and some of the beard, and for decades afterward dinner guests at his house reported that the doctor would produce the neck bone of Charles I and pass it around the table, and some said he used it as a salt holder, a detail his family denied and his guests kept repeating. 75 years later, In 1888, a mortified royal household finally took the relic back, and the future Edward VII personally returned it to the vault, sealed in a small ebony casket, dropped through an opening onto Charles's coffin, an apology delivered by mail slot. And Henry, through all this, Henry was right there, inches away, the whole time, and the 1813 party gave his coffin a long look and left a description that has fed nightmares ever since. The metal shell measured 6 feet 10 inches. Time or something had not been kind to it. The account describes the coffin as beaten in by violence about the middle, the sides crushed inward, and through the opening where the metal had given way, the visitors could see directly into it, and what they saw was a skeleton. Halford's phrasing is clinical and somehow worse for it, a mere skeleton of the king, with some beard remaining upon the chin, but nothing else to distinguish the personage contained in it. Set those words against the Justinian dispatch from 300 years earlier, the handsomest potentate the ambassador ever set eyes on, the glowing skin, the calf he showed off in doorways, and let the two descriptions shake hands. Some beard upon the chin, nothing to distinguish the personage. Every ounce of the flesh that had tyrannized a court's nostrils, the massive trunk, the ruined legs, all of it had gone to liquid and dust inside the shell and departed, and what remained of the largest personality in English history could not be told from any other man's bones except by the box and the address. They did not open his coffin further or disturb the remains. Charles got the autopsy. Henry got a glance through his own broken wall, and the party withdrew, and the vault was sealed once more. The whole visit, by Halford's account, was brisk, a single morning spent calling on 3 reigns of the dead. What crushed the coffin is a genuinely open question with 3 candidates, and each one carries its own flavor of grim. The first is the 1649 burial party, working fast and nervous in a cramped chamber, possibly striking or crowding the old coffin while maneuvering Charles's into a space with very little room to spare, damage by clumsiness. The second suggestion came from the chapel's own surveyor, who examined the vault again in 1888 and made careful drawings, and who concluded from the way the metal had failed that the force had come from inside, pushing outward, the pressure of decomposition in a sealed vessel finding its release at the weakest seam. In other words, the same process the Syon story describes, finishing the job in the privacy of the vault. The third is simpler still, that a wooden trestle or support under the great coffin gave way at some point across the centuries, and the whole mass fell and split on the brickwork. Take your pick, or take all 3 across 300 years. Whichever way it happened, the outcome sits under the choir of St. George's Chapel right now, tonight, a burst shell with a skeleton in it, and if the surveyor of 1888 was right, then the body of Henry VIII ruptured its own coffin from within, one final eruption from a corpse that had spent its last decade of life doing more or less the same thing on a slower schedule. Every few years, somebody proposes settling the medical arguments the modern way, and the answer never changes. In 2012, archaeologists in Leicester lifted a municipal car park and found Richard III, the King Henry's own father defeated for this crown, lying where the Greyfriars Church had once stood, and DNA matched against living descendants confirmed the identification to the satisfaction of essentially everyone. The find rewrote textbooks, settled a 500-year argument about the shape of his spine, gave him a new tomb in Leicester Cathedral, and put an obvious idea in the air. If Richard could be tested, why not Henry? A sample from the bones under St. George's could confirm or kill the Kell blood theory in a laboratory afternoon, could screen for markers of half the conditions on the list we walked through earlier, could finally attach a name to what destroyed him, and with it to what drove the annulments and the executions and the break with Rome. The requests have been floated, publicly and more than once, and the position of the chapel and the crown has stayed exactly where you would expect it to stay. Richard was a lost king in forgotten ground under tarmac, and digging him up was archaeology. Henry lies in a marked royal vault in a working royal chapel, under the care of the institution he did so much to shape, and opening that floor would be an exhumation requiring permissions nobody with the authority to give them has any intention of giving. So the theories from earlier in this video stay theories, probably forever. The one set of remains in England that could answer the most argued over medical questions in Tudor history belongs to the one man whose grave no one will agree to disturb, a king who spent his life making the condition of his body a state secret enforced by the axe, and who has somehow managed to keep enforcing it without the axe for 5 centuries and counting. One more thread before we close the floor over him for good. Windsor and Hampton Court both carry ghost stories about Henry, and given the traffic those buildings see, of course they do. At Hampton Court, the famous screaming apparition in the gallery belongs to Catherine Howard, dragged back toward the chapel doors. But Henry has his own reported hauntings, and the detail that keeps recurring in the Windsor versions is the sound. Visitors and staff across the years have described hearing, in the cloisters and passages near St. George's, slow footsteps with a drag in them, a heavy tread and then a scrape. The gait of a big man hauling a bad leg, sometimes with a low groaning attached. None of it is evidence of anything except what the building's occupants carry in their heads, and what they carry 5 centuries on is the limp. The ghost people report walks with a heavy tread and a scrape, a giant in pain hauling himself through his own palace, replayed down the corridors at night. All the propaganda he commissioned, the portraits, the pageantry, the sworn silence of his court, and the detail that survived in the walls is the ruined leg. He spent a fortune deciding how he would be remembered. The corridors decided otherwise. Today, a plain slab of black marble sits in the choir floor above the vault, and its inscription was only added in 1837 by order of William IV, nearly 3 centuries late, a bare listing of the contents: Henry, Jane, Charles, and the infant. Tourists walk across it all day, most without stopping, some without noticing, on their way to see the banners and the stalls of the Garter Knights. The grandest tomb ever conceived in England came to this, a floor tile. Underneath their feet, 3 feet down or so, the crushed coffin lies where the yeomen strained to lower it in the candlelight of February 16th, 1547. Next to Jane, who has waited longer, and Charles, who arrived headless, and the baby with no name. The daily masses he endowed to run while the world endured went silent within 2 years of his death. The monument was never built. The prophecy of the friar, if you credit the old story, was paid out on a chapel floor at Syon in the dark. And the man who spent a lifetime commanding how he would be seen, who jailed and killed people for describing his body, his health, his mortality, ended as the one thing he never authorized: a cautionary exhibit, a skeleton glimpsed through a split seam by a party of Regency gentlemen holding candles, with some beard remaining upon the chin, and nothing else to distinguish the personage. That's where I'll leave him. Thanks for spending a couple of hours in the 16th century with me. Genuinely, it never stops amazing me that people do. If this one got under your skin, the comments are open. Tell me which detail is going to follow you around. Everything that keeps this channel alive, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships, is linked down in the description and in the pinned comment. And if you're already supporting, you're the reason these keep coming. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.